Welcome back to another episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. My name is Sam Cook. I'm the founder of the Ukraine Military History Institute and the co-host of the Ukraine Military History Podcast, where we examine Ukrainian military history from the beginning all the way to the current war against Russia. And today's episode is from the Current War series with our military analysts, Rob Lee, Dima Putiata, and a special guest, Ryan O'Leary, who's an active service member in the Ukrainian Armed Forces. And what they were discussing today, and it's timely, it's a huge historical moment, is the dismissal of the cabinet under President Zelensky is as of July 15th, 2026. President Zelensky dismissed his entire cabinet, the prime minister, and submitted a new set of candidates to take over, including the new prime minister. But most controversially, he dismissed the defense minister, Mykhailo Fedorov, who'd only been in office for 6 months, was widely respected by a lot of members of the military, but also Ukrainian civil society broadly. And his dismissal has triggered a very big crisis inside the Ukrainian government and civil society, with protests on the street for the second day in a row as of today's filming. And what Rob and Dima and Ryan all get together and discuss is a very lengthy discussion on the thinking behind this move, the political ramifications of it, how the soldiers feel, how society feels about it. Of course, all of them living here in Kyiv, like myself. And we split it up into a two-part series because there's just so much material here. I want to give you a chance to digest it. The first episode here is really about the political thinking behind this, the decision-making, introducing you to Ryan, who this is his first time appearing on the podcast. And they go into this in detail, some colorful moments, especially with Ryan, who is not holding back on what a lot of soldiers feel that he is communicating through his position here on the podcast. So enjoy.
All right. Hey, everyone. This is Rob Lee. It's another installment of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. As usual, I'm joined by my colleague, Dima Putiata, and this time with my friend Ryan O'Leary, who we've talked to many times before. Guys, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, good to see you.
All right, so we were filming this on July, I think, 18th, on Friday, the 18th. 17th. Okay, thank you, Ryan. Already helping. It's on the 17th, so it's probably come out in a week or so. And basically, we're going to discuss the events of the week. It's been a pretty kind of tumultuous week here in Kyiv, where there's been a government reshuffle. The big news kind of that the former defense minister, Mykhailo Fedorov, has been replaced. Right now, the President Zelensky has put forward Kamara, the former commander or the acting head of SBU, former commander of SBU Alpha. This has led to significant kind of pushback. There's been protests in Kyiv, protests in other places. There's been a bigger kind of generational kind of discussion because there's a conversation that is partially about the kind of younger generation versus older generation, a variety of kind of interesting topics here. So the main thing we're going to talk about is kind of what's happening right now, and ask both of you, since you're veterans, you're still serving, Ryan, Dima, you got out, but kind of your take on what's happening, talk about some of the internal problems of the Ukrainian military, and kind of get your take on, the developments this week.
Yeah, I think it would be great because from what I saw on Twitter, frankly speaking, people definitely a little bit delusional in terms of everything. You can see a lot of support in terms of Fedorov, but I think that the back idea of that, it's not only just to support Fedorov as a person, maybe as a future politician, but the idea is here not to allow other people with maybe not the best past to take role of this position. But we can see that some people from National Guard supported Klymenko positions, which was quite surprisingly for me, frankly speaking. But in the same time, we see these changes. I don't think the president will turn it over. That we'll continue seeing this kind of development, or I would say degradation rather. And we'll have a new Ministry of Defense. And Fedorov, at his latest present meeting, he told the publicity a lot of problems that Ukrainian army has. That's absolutely true. Some of them appear during this war. Another one, it's like lasts for decades. And it seems like, especially after 4 years in the army and being part of the system, it seems like that some of things are not changeable, to be honest, at least here and right now. Of course, it's very hard to do some reforms during the war for any country, but the thing is that you definitely need to do this. You must do some reforms. Of course, they will be painful. Not all of them will like, not because they might be bad, just because people might not understand the back idea of this due to the lack of experience or just maybe tunnels way of thinking and other things. But right now we have this quite a bad situation that Fedorov kind of pulled everything on red and officially accused Syrskyi in a lot of fails, which you can support or you cannot. It depends. I don't want to say that I strongly support Fedorov in all of his statements that he said recently, because I know that just as for Fedorov, the same is for Syrskyi. Sometimes it's very hard to change something, even if you're in charge of that.
Right.
Because it's like every time it happens here in Ukraine when we have a new president, people expect way too much from president, from a parliament, and they want to see quick reforms like in 5 months, and everything should be changed drastically. But it doesn't work like that. In some cases, for some big reforms, it takes even 5 and more years when you will see this kind of impact. And it's like reminded me this kind of recent articles that some journalists had a conversation with Ukrainian, I suppose, battalion and brigade commander anonymously, that he said, I don't feel the impact on the front line because of middle strikes. Of course you don't, because it takes a lot of time. You cannot just destroy 40 trucks and a couple of bridges and you will see the instant impact. It takes a lot of time, at least 6 months, even more. Then you will see Russian are slowing down. And you cannot only rely on, on middle strike and think that, they stopped Russian advance. Russian advance stops at tactical and, of course, at operational level. And, of course, with the pressure at the strategic level, while we are targeting the strategic refineries and factories and stuff like that.
So yeah, you mentioned Klymenko, the head of the Interior Ministry. His name put forward this week, but that he was the initial choice to replace Fedorov, and then it appears that he didn't have enough support yesterday. And so then what it seems to be reporting said is that Zelensky came up with, I guess, multiple names to replace Fedorov, and then ultimately chose Kamara, at least in the acting role, but it's still not clear exactly who's gonna replace him. And you were saying before, the commander of the Azov Corps at Redis, commander of the Hartia Corps, Cornet, both supported him, both said kind of positive things. Some other people did as well, but there was in general a kind of backlash to his kind of name being put forward compared to Fedorov, because Fedorov is seen as kind of this more modern kind of facing guy, and then maybe not the same thing from the Interior Ministry, which doesn't always have the best kind of reputation, historically. Ryan, what's your take on this week?
Oh boy! I mean, there's a lot to unpackage.
Let's keep the language here PG.
Yeah. I'll try not to cuss and stuff. I mean, there's been a lot of changes. I think Ukraine shoots itself in the foot all the time with this stuff. Like, if you ask anyone who's served for a while, the changes that were happening in 2026 has been mainly positive. You have, better logistics, better supply of drones. Some brigades, for the most part, were getting more listened to when it comes to procurement. And I think the standardization of, the drone warfare spectrum was a good idea. So, I mean, things were moving in a very good, forward pace or forward momentum. And at the Ministry of Defense level, it was probably the first time where, the MOD was actually doing public outreach, actually, showing results and moving forward and actually innovating and doing stuff. Look, I've been here since 2022. Typically the MOD is the MOD. Nobody really knows fully what's going on, who's doing what. And so Fedorov sort of changed that, and more stuff was becoming, in front of the public, like, hey, we're trying to do X, Y, Z. This is where we're at with this part, this part, this part. So I think for Ukrainians, it was a huge, change of pace. I think for service members in general, whether foreign or Ukrainian, it was, a positive thing and like not really a motivator, but a morale booster saying, hey, look, they're actually listening to us. I do have my criticisms. Obviously, I think the foreign side of things was going really slow, but it's never really been a priority for Ukraine. I think one of the biggest issues that Zelensky is going to keep facing is they always keep changing the ministers of whatever, minister of defense, prime minister, minister of, whatever department. But at the end of the day, there's one area that never changes. And I think next time, instead of messing around with the ministries, they should just gut the general staff and switch it out. So that's my personal opinion.
Pretty bold opinion.
Yeah, but I mean, look, man, we've been facing the same issues since 2023 with, the mindset towards mobilization, the morale and I would say respect of the ministries and respect of the military. There's just been a gradual decline. And if we look who's been in charge a majority of that time, the only ones that aren't changing is the general staff. And I put this out on Twitter 2 weeks ago, if you're running a business and you consistently have employee turnover, low work quality, low work effort, do you just consistently keep that going, or do you find out what's wrong with the management and change up the management? Your military is the same thing. It needs to be a well-oiled machine. If it's only oiled in certain parts and not the other, then you need to change the leadership out. Whoever that would be, I don't know. I just know it's not working as it is, especially for foreigners at the general staff level. I mean, we're year 4 in the war and you still can't do as a foreigner, it's 4 years in the war. We don't have access to Army of Plus. We don't have access to DIA. The residency route is a mess.
Okay.
You can't transfer from the National Guard to land forces legally. You can't transfer from the National Guard to SSO. The only way to do anything is basically cancel contract, wait 2 months, sign a new contract. And there's this issue where it's hard to retain foreigners, but it's also at the same time hard to retain mobilized because everyone goes AWOL. There's a lot of compounding issues that just aren't getting addressed. So change the management, address the issues, move on.
All right, I want to come back to that because you wrote a thing for our Substack about issues about how foreign fighters are treated and some recommendations about how to kind of improve the system.
Yep.
So we'll come back in a second. So I think, Fedorov, he's been in charge about 6 months, so it's a short tenure. The previous minister before that also is about 6 months. I think it's an issue where you need ministers in place for longer because and in particular, being a minister of defense, it's really a bureaucratic role, but you have to understand the bureaucracy. And so, I think it's similar in the U.S. where Secretary of Defense to war, where it's nice to have military background, but you need to be someone who understands the bureaucracy and how to run it. And one of the benefits of Fedorov is that because he's at the Ministry of Digital Transformation for 5 years, whatever, that ministry, when the war began, started to take on new responsibilities. So the MOD was taking care of regular procurement for artillery, tanks, kind of regular systems. Ministry of Digital Transformation took over procurement of UAVs, of new technology, new innovations. And of course, Fedorov set up Brave One, this kind of incubator startup thing for the Ukraine defense companies. So he has hands in a lot of things. And so when he took over as Minister of Defense, he already had a background seeing problems in procurement, problems in the defense industry, foreign support, so on. And so he was almost uniquely in a good position to understand, to make changes quickly without having to take 6 months to learn what's happening. He actually had a good idea initially on. I thought it was quite positive when he was chosen initially for that reason. He is quite tech savvy, and this war is a high tech war. And I think a lot of people, I feel like I'm too old in some respects this because the drone stuff changes very quickly. I did not study radio signals enough when I was in the Marines. I should have. But a lot of those things are much more complex and you need to have understanding of these things. So when he came in, he had a number of forms he tried to implement, right? So he had One about new contracts for service members. That was trying to kind of fix the mobilization system to some extent. There's other issues about trying to have equality in brigades of manpower, where everyone gets the same amount of manpower. Right now, we know there's a significant variation where some brigades get very few people, some regiments get a lot of people, and it's not equal at all. And also some kind of standardization of drones. Because for Mavics, for commercial drones, FPVs, units always rely on donations. They don't get enough from the government, and he tried to kind of streamline that, among other kind of things. I think a lot of these things were positive steps. The execution, I don't think, always worked, and it's not clear the execution is easy in that respect. But I think conceptually the ideas were good. Whether or not it would have, worked over time is kind of a broader question. But again, he only had 6 months. It's kind of hard to achieve what you want in 6 months. I would say the general feeling, right, is that the situation has gotten better in the war the last 6 months. Now, to what extent is that him being Minister of Defense or other kind of factors? Probably a combination. Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. It's definitely a combination. We cannot praise or criticize one man or one ministry for everything. And you mentioned that Fedorov was Minister of Defense for 6 months. But before Fedorov, we had Shmyhal, who was the Minister of Defense for much less than 6 months. And we continue doing this kind of replacements without giving people a chance.
Right.
Of course, previous Minister of Defense, for example, Umarov, he was a Minister of Defense for a long period of time. And if we look back, how it happens that Fedorov became a Minister of Defense, we need to understand what happened in Ukraine back then. We had this scandal with Mindigate,
right?
Kind of, or how you call it, where President seems like he decided to
shuffle the board.
Yeah, to do nothing, but in the same time to replace some people, and Fedorov became a Minister of Defense. And I think that he would never ever be a Minister of Defense if this scandal wouldn't happen. But unfortunately, we have these problems with replacing people in a couple of months, not only from the presidential perspective, but also in the army. Somehow, we think that if you have a new brigade commander, for example, he need to be good in a couple of months. But the point is, brigade, if, for example, consists of 4,000, 5,000 men, I mean, some of them are, but a lot of them nope. But still, there are a lot of things in brigade. And you need a lot of time to find out who is good there, who is not, how to communicate with them. But somehow I know a couple of brigades, they change brigade commander 3 times per year. It's not enough for potential colonel or mayor who is in charge of the brigade to show himself as a good leader, as a good manager. So it's one of the problems that we'll definitely discuss later, but I do not really understand why do we expect so much changes in such a short period of time. We really expect way too much. And talking about these improvements in the front line, we need to understand that they started maybe more than a year ago, while Russians changed their tactics from normal assault groups with infantry fighting vehicles, with groups that consisted of 7-10 stormtroopers, with a pot of UAVs, to this so-called infiltration. Of course, it appears to be right now definitely not efficient as Russians expected it to be. And all of this, it's like you started something, for example, 1.5 years ago, and right now we see the result. And now we see the results that Ryan mentions, that we definitely see this new approach. We saw this new approach of defense, that we gave our maneuver brigades more capabilities for this. That was one of the biggest problems that we had, and we still have, because right now we see that, for example, unmanned system forces, they are trying to, which is absolutely right, trying to put their attention to middle strike and deep strike. But before that, and still right now, they have thousands of drone operators who are working at tactical level and literally fighting from zero line to 10 kilometers deep. Maybe in some cases more, but this is like the vast majority of them. And not surprisingly, they're working with the same tools as maneuver brigades did. Or still do.
Right.
So it's definitely a lot of a lot of things that started before, and right now we see much better results because of this.
Yeah, I think too, like, so I don't know, again, like, I agree with you. I don't know if you can put everything on Fedorov or before Fedorov, but the biggest thing that Fedorov did is he opened it up. He, like, showed, hey, these are our results so far. This is what we're moving to. So, like, there was more, I feel like there was just more communication. He kept the Ukrainian people more aware of what's going on. There was less questions on, like, hey, what is the Ministry of Defense actually doing? It wasn't like the last 6 months, we were never questioning, like, what is the MOD spending the money on? What are they doing procurement? Like, we saw the increase of our drones that we were receiving with the unit I'm in. You could see the gradual shift from this whole kill everyone at a kilometer deep at the front line to, hey, now we're expanding into, like, the Hornet gets a lot of it, but there's other fixed wing mid-strike drones that, if you pay attention on certain telegrams, like, you can see a drastic increase in that. So, like, I don't know if you can give it all to Fedorov for the credit on it, but what you can give him is that he was the one saying, hey, this is what we're actually doing. He was more open about it.
Yep.
And with that, the biggest thing that I've noticed with Ukrainian society is there's always this, fear question of what the ministers are doing, what the government's doing. And, like, I think by Fedorov opening up the Ministry of Defense a little bit more than what's normally there, it brought some trust back into, what people perceived as the MOD actually doing. I think a lot of people, Ukrainians and foreigners, also, then attribute all that to Fedorov. But in reality, like, him just opening up, doing better at press briefings, at, bringing on advisors like Syrskyi Flash, Sternenko, and, like, doing outreach actually showed, like, hey, this is the actual improvement. So, like, even if it's not all attributed to Fedorov, like, him opening up and showing where money's getting used, where resources are, where the time's being spent, I think it restored a lot of faith in the MOD, at least up until now. I think with this whole reshuffle, and, like, I think Westerners also need to understand, once you fire the prime minister or the prime minister resigns, whatever, like, the ministers all get pulled out too. So, like, they didn't just fire Fedorov, like, it had to be done legally. But, like, he could have also then, put him as a candidate. But I think people need to understand that, the trust in the institutions is the biggest thing that's lacking in Ukraine, which is, like, look, I don't hate Syrskyi, I don't like him, it's whatever. But the biggest thing is there's no trust in the general staff anymore. There definitely isn't with foreign fighters. And I don't think the Ukrainian servicemen are very well liking of the general staff either. Obviously, they won't speak out. I'll speak out because I'm a foreigner. They put me in jail, no big deal. I'll get back out and go back to my unit. I've been here 4 years. I've been in far worse than in trouble with the Ukrainian government. So, but I think the biggest issue that Fedorov did, or the biggest thing that he did that was an advantage or a positive, was basically, like, and probably not even on purpose, but he brought back some trust back into the MOD, back to the public. And, like, that's the biggest thing that's lacking in Ukraine. So why we have mobilization issues, partly, not fully, but, like, so I think whoever it is, whether it's Kamara or the former interior minister, whoever does it, like, they just need to be more open, and they're going to have to build that trust back up again. We're probably, like, below zero now for trust.
I absolutely agree with you that he did great in terms of showing what kind of they're planning to do, because we definitely had a huge gap in this. And I think that's the reason why people support him.
It's all about public affairs.
Yeah, because he is a former SMM manager and he knows how to, sell, how to introduce yourself to the publicity.
But another thing about this is that, after the summer offensive failed 2023, it didn't seem as though Ukraine had a coherent strategy for, like, 2 years or so,
Not at
right?
all.
Well, I don't think anyone really ever took the time to lay out a strategy to the public. Like, whatever, you can argue, was Fedorov's strategy good? Was it wrong? Was it burning down the house? Like, depending who you ask. But at the end of the day, at least he voiced a strategy.
Right.
And, like, again, that's what helped rebuild the trust for the Ukrainians and probably the foreign partners as well, is basically he was like, hey, look, I'm doing this, this, and this, and we want to do it within this time frame. And, like, here's, our feedback loop. Here's a number you can call or telegram you can message. and we'll listen to your feedback. Do they listen to all of it? Probably not. But like, at least he laid out something of a strategy and started following through. Some of it was like very minor steps, and some of it was never going to get completed, if we're honest. Like he was saying about this whole mobilization reform from the top down, bottom up. Like, most people understand that's like, you know, the golden goose. It'll never fully happen, but at least he said it. You know, at least he's like, hey, this is what we're going for. And like, that's the first time in 4 years I've been here that's been done.
That definitely increases your morale, because as Rob mentioned, we failed with our kind of the largest counteroffensive. Of course, I remember myself back then, frankly speaking, I was doomed. And I asked myself, okay, what we are doing next? What's the strategy? How we gonna win? And what does to win this war mean for Ukraine?
Right.
I just found this answer for myself, that we need to stop Russians. And of course, we cannot talk, at least back then, cannot talk about bringing occupied territories back. So, but the key idea, we should stop Russians and make Ukrainians live here and, not to fail as a nation. Fine, okay. But how to achieve this? That was the biggest question for me. Even my rank was a sergeant. I'm also a human being, and I'm a citizen of this country, and I was asking myself, how are we going to achieve this? What we are doing? And what I had? Absolutely silence. And of course, no one is supposed to tell me how we're going to do this. But at least after years of war, you expect to see some kind of strategy. But I just, some period of time, I realized that we have, in a lot of cases, zero strategy in terms of economy, in terms of war in general.
I mean, there's probably strategies that are talked about, but again, the biggest thing is the Ukrainian institutions are terrible at, like,
we don't have them.
Yeah, you have them, but it's just nobody knows how to talk to the public. And then if they do, they're always like, oh, we can't because it's part of war, blah, 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 state secret. But in reality, if somebody just came out and said, hey, our goal isn't just to survive, we want to do X, Y, Z, you know, at least that would show like, hey, this is what we're actually doing. Like, again, I think Fedorov did an amazing job with that. Whether some of his goals were realistic or his objectives were realistic, most likely not. But at least he said it. At least he said, you know, because at that point, once you say it, you own it. And if you own it, that means like people are going to hold you to it. So at least they say, hey, look, you know, if he was still the minister 7 months from now and mobilization isn't changed or the recruitment isn't changed, at least we know we can say, hey, what about this that you were going to do? And, you know, then, you know, there's somebody that actually has responsibility. When you put out clear objectives, clear goals, clear path forward, you not only own it, but now there's responsibility. So people actually feel that they, you know, have someone to go to when it doesn't happen. And Ukraine is very bad at doing that, both on a military level and on a political level with institutions.
So I think, you know, one of the things that I identify as kind of an issue, you know, after the summer offensive, is that Ukraine, you'd hear things about tactics or operation, but not strategic level. It was below that. We're like, okay, we're going to try to do this or this. And it's like, okay, but what is the strategy? As an example, the Kursk operation. The initial execution is very good. It didn't last too long. But again, it came back to, okay, how does Kursk fit into a broader strategy? And that was never clear to me, where it was an effective operation at the operational level. But then, of course, if the strategy is, you know, maybe it's okay, it's going to be a limited operation to get POWs, so you can trade back people, or to you know, force Russia to commit resources elsewhere on the border, away from Donetsk region. Okay, but the overall strategy, you know, is a small part of it. And it seemed to me it took over the strategic thinking, where it's like, okay, now Kursk is everything because we've made it a big political thing. It's embarrassing to Putin. But is that actually, you know, a theory? Exactly. Is it a theory of success? And to me, it was never clear it was. And so I think, you know, when I was hearing about Fedorov the first time, he came up with the strategy in 2024. And he was already kind of circling this inside in the government. And it was already, you know, it's like, again, you can point out issues with it, but he had a coherent strategy for the war, saying, here's what we need to do. Here's the steps to get to there. Here's the ultimate objective, right? It was a realistic objective. And we came in, I think it was quite useful to bring this in because, again, for us in the U.S., we always have some kind of national security strategy. We have the DoD has its own, I forgot, it was a defense strategy. I forget. I should know better. We do a quadrennial review, right, every 4 years as well. There are issues with all these documents. Anytime the documents come out, they get attacked and, you know, and people pick at the words and so on. But it becomes a thing where the senior government levels, they are laying out intent, saying, here's how we see the world, here's how we see defense. And then everyone below that says, okay, here's where I fit into this strategy, right? If you don't have a strategy, then units are doing things, but it's like, what are we building to is unclear. Fedorov, I mean, this year he mentioned he wanted to get the Russian casualty number to 50,000. I personally didn't think that was the best kind of figure. First off, because I'm not sure you can achieve it. Second one, I think the attrition ratio is more important in some respects. But again, it was, okay, we're going to try to increase the number of Russian casualties. This is how we see, some theory of victory, essentially. Of course, you have the deep strike campaign, middle strike campaign, increasing problems for Russian logistics, increasing costs. And this is kind of back to the theory of victory of, okay, we make the war unsustainable for Russia to some extent, while denying them the ability to take more territory. And so then it came, you had some kind of strategy, I think, which was useful. As you said, it's useful to kind of, say, okay, does this make sense? Does not make sense? But at least it's being voiced. I agree with you. I think it was very good that he had a bigger public messaging campaign because people need to know what's going on. Soldiers of the front line need to know what's going on. If they don't know, how long is the war going to go on? How do my actions, fit within a broader strategy? Those are questions that are not good to have. It should have some kind of answer, right? So I think all those things were positive. I agree. I think people are making a black and white issue where everything that succeeded is because of him. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, I think he did good things. He's had a hand in middle strike, hand in drones, hand in a lot of these things. It's the result of success of a lot of people, right?
Yep. First of all, of servicemen.
Yes.
And even of that general cells that all of us don't like.
But I think the biggest issue we're going to have going forward, or Ukraine's going to have, is look, Kamara. I've worked with people under him before. Great at strategy, great at operational, great at asymmetrical warfare. But the problem is he's coming from an operational group, SB Alpha. They're not public. They don't do public affairs. Like they have one or two public affairs guys for whatever, 20,000 of them, whatever the number is.
He's
but that's what I mean. Like they're not good at the public outreach. And for him to be a career SB Alpha guy, like he's going to struggle, when it comes to addressing the public, not so much addressing to our allies behind the scenes, but like it's always better when, again, somebody like Fedorov says publicly, this is what we're doing, because even though, the public's always going to get one side of it, and then behind the scenes, you're going to have it for the Western allies, but then your Western allies can also go to their own people and say, hey, yeah, this is what they're doing. And I think Kamara's going to be good. Like Kamara will be good at the, probably fixing some of the issues, but he's going to be really bad at communicating what the issues are that he's fixing, how he's fixing it, and what the path forward. I don't know if the Minister of Interior is going to be any better at it. I hope they hire a public affairs person that knows what they're doing. Otherwise, they're going to struggle. I mean, struggle not really so much. Like they might do good work behind the scenes, but they're going to struggle with the public perception. They're going to struggle with public trust. And then, 6 months from now, we'll have another Ministry of Defense because Zelensky's tired of the public protesting or getting angry about, things not being done. Because if it's not communicated what's being done, people will get upset.
And I think, I tweeted about this the other day, but Kamara, as you said, he's very well respected, right? Career Alpha officer, career Special Operations officer. Keep in mind, SPU Alpha is not a military unit, right? So his background is not going through company command, battalion command, and so on. It is a very specialized counterterrorism unit, domestic counterterrorism unit that has now branched out into a variety of things because of the war. It's maybe one of the most innovative units in Ukraine. It did Operation Spiderweb. They're always near the top in E-points. They've gone very heavily into drones at task level, operational, strategic level. President Zelensky mentioned yesterday he wants him kind of overseeing deep strike. I'm not sure that's really what the Minister of Defense should be doing. I think all I've heard is good things about him, that he's a trustworthy person, which is important, but also he's very, very competent. But the question is, what background do you need to be a successful minister?
Absolutely.
Well, I think he'll have procurement experience and stuff like that, because SB runs their own setup compared to your general staff, Ministry of Defense. But yeah, I think. When it comes to fixing some of the issues, he'll be good at. Some he's not going to be good at. Mobilization. Look, SBU doesn't mobilize people typically. They mobilize them. They help with mobilization, but typically SBU, especially SBU Alpha, is all voluntary.
Right.
It's a very select few that make it even through selection. I think he's going to struggle with a lot of the more of your mainstream military issues,
Right.
and how to change that. But I think a lot of it'll be who his advisors are. And again, I think his biggest hurdle is going to be public. How can he change public perception back into, hey, Fedorov's gone, but look, we're still going to continue, increasing our effectiveness, reforming the mobilization, reforming procurement, and I think he can do a lot of it, but I think his biggest issue is going to be the public perception. And that's going to be the biggest, if he lasts 6 months, 1 month, even if he ends up being the permanent one, that'll be his biggest issue. I think same with the Minister of Interior, because neither one of them are really a public-facing person. I don't know if there's really a good fit for a MOD that's public-facing right now.
Well, to be honest, first of all, everyone will compare Maro with Fedorov.
Yeah.
And another thing is that, from my perspective, I think that Maro has this problem, which is not problem, that he is a soldier from the bottom of his heart. And being in charge of MOD, it's, frankly speaking, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind, I will come back to the topic about 50K per month. From my perspective, when the first time I heard it, back then I was serviceman, it was definitely, for me, a populism statement, to be honest, because it's also was a question for me, okay, to kill more Russians, sounds good, sounds great, no one will doubt that, but what if we will pay more attention to the topic where we will secure our forces? Because sometimes you of course you need to destroy your enemy at different depths and different levels. Absolutely true, but we have a lot of issues still for years that our maneuver brigades, who are responsible for the front and seems like responsible for everything, they don't have even right now a needed support from other units and even from the army corps, because it's quite hard for them to fight under the corps command to which they would be detached. And for me, it's all the time a mix whether you need to destroy more enemies and secure your forces. Because, okay, we kill 5 Russians, but 2 Ukrainians also being killed. Is it good for us? I don't think so. Or wounded. I mean, if you lost your eye, leg, whatever, you're out of military. So but people do not ask and think about that, seems like. But it's good to make this kind of statements that we will destroy as much as possible. Yeah, right. But also another question: how to achieve that? What if your enemy is not advancing in some areas? For example, the last year I spent there was in Le Mans. The Third Army Corps literally stopped their advance, and Russians were not capable of moving forward. So it was on regular basis that we saw, with the help of drones, of course, the front line, and no one was moving there. So what to do in this case? Of course, they advance in some areas because they also limited with their resources, like Alexandrivka direction near Huliaipole, kind of Pokrovsk direction, but the rest of the front line is kind of dead. So no one also told me how to achieve that and what to do next.
But so I've been pretty vocal about anti 50K a month. The biggest thing also people tend to forget is we're limited on manpower. So if we're allocating all of these drone teams to kill 50,000 Russians a month, that means we're taking away the allocation ability for them to do for them to do mid-strike. Mid-strike being like 20 to 100 kilometers, where your drone logistics are, where, your assembly plants are, everything like that. So when we're doing the 50,000 a month, it sounds good on paper until you realize that we're focusing a majority of our assets into doing this. And it doesn't do much when your enemy has 2 million reserves that they haven't even called up yet. And I think we put too much emphasis on it, and it didn't, and we didn't really stop a lot of the Russian progress. And I think we could have handled it better by going after logistics, going more in depth. A majority of our strikes for the first 4 months of this year was within a kilometer of the zero line. Like,
And before
why are we, killing your enemy at the zero line is not a strategy any military ever does. The goal is to kill them before they get to your troops, not while they're at your troops or engaging them. So I think we should have put more emphasis on preventing them from even getting close to us, especially in wintertime. Look, August, September, October, when it started getting cold, this was like the coldest winter on record. I would much rather we, make them walk 20 kilometers to zero versus, them being able to drive 5 kilometers and then they get hit at 1 kilometer. Like, let's tire them out, make them walk, make them freeze to death before they even get close to the zero.
Okay, so I would say, so Fedorov did mention 50,000 a month, but he also has been pushing the middle strike.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not an either or for him. He's done both. Some of this comes back to the strategic thinking, right? Because, are you adopting an attritional strategy where you are inflicting too many losses on the other side as a way of kind of winning or ending the war? Or are you trying to attack the system, the kind of maneuver warfare type thinking where you say, here's the center of gravity in Russian military, here's critical vulnerability, we're going to remove this, and that's our way of kind of, stopping the actual advance. The problem with the attritional strategy, okay, first off, Russia has more people. As a country, they are remarkably insensitive to casualties, right? They're taking massive casualties. There are no massive protests in Russia happening. Where is that breaking point is, I don't know, right? That is a very difficult thing to say. Is it now, if Russia does mobilization in a few months, which people are mentioning, will that lead to political problems? Maybe, or maybe not, right? Maybe Russia then has 200,000 more people, right? Which they can commit to Chernihiv, a new offensive, who knows? Crimea is also a good question too, because we're seeing a successful campaign there, right? Where Ukraine is isolating Crimea, massive fuel shortages across Russia right now. Really big logistics issues in Crimea. There's no electricity. Used to be this great, vacation place in the summertime. Russians are not vacationing there anymore. It was this really important foreign policy objective of Putin's, right? Where all the things he can say, here's what I achieved. I took back Crimea. It's a popular thing among Russians, at least it was before the war. Even Navalny kind of supported it more or less. But now Crimea is not a strength, right? Now Ukraine reliably can hit pretty much anything they want within Crimea. There are no military targets that are particularly safe there. The Black Sea Fleet was removed. There's reporting that the Black Sea headquarters might have been removed, so on. But the question is, okay, Crimea now, it's a liability. It's much more difficult for Russia there. But what does that mean, right? What does this mean in the context of ending the war, right? And because remember, the 2023 summer offensive, the idea behind it was that if you threaten Crimea, that Putin cares enough about Crimea where he might make a deal. He might say, okay, like let's come to terms. What if no one rises up? What if it's like, okay, yeah, Crimea it's not a good situation, but Russians will leave, whatever. But ultimately, if Russians just put up with it, they get used to it, and there's no pressure on Putin, is it actually a way of ending the war? That part is still not clear to me.
I don't think Crimea is going to end the war by us blowing up gas stations, whatever else. But there is clearly a difference between a bunch of Russian bodies getting sent back to Russia versus, some dumbass not being able to, some person not being able to fill their fuel up.
Like, man, you too, I think it's okay.
There's been far more Russians complaining about not being able to get gasoline than they have about all the dead going back. So look, this should be a pretty positive thing that Ukraine should be able to look at. Look, they don't care that 50,000 Russians are going home in boxes and missing legs every month, but what do they care about? They care about not getting fuel in their vehicles, and they care about not having electricity.
Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely a positive dynamic, right? I'd also say that, if you look at the war a year ago, right, when Trump took office, it was a point where, Trump said famously, Zelensky, you have no cards, where Russia has the kind of leverage. And if they did negotiate, Russia was demanding not just freezing the front line, but also all the rest of the Donetsk region, right? He said, you need to make concessions to end the war. Now, the leverage has changed, right? Because Ukraine has much more leverage if there were negotiations, and, who knows what's going to happen. This dynamic is better, and so when negotiations happen, I think from Ukraine's perspective, it's like, okay, we can freeze the front line. We're not going to make any other concessions beyond that because we don't need to, because you can't advance, and we can see the cost you're having in Russia. That dynamic is definitely positive. The point I'm raising is, where's the breaking point for Russia? Where's the point where you do this, you attack this one thing, you remove this from Russia, you cause Putin to have to negotiate. I don't know exactly what that is.
I would say if we're talking like Crimea or occupied areas, I would say the breaking point's going to be when the Russian military needs to move assets into these areas to keep governance. What I mean by that is, like, look, for Crimea, the people are only going to put up without having running water, without having electricity, without having fuel for their vehicles only for so long.
But maybe they leave.
Well, I mean, if they leave, then what are they going to, like, then there's, like, that's fine. Everyone leaves. Perfect. Lower economy for them.
Yeah.
They lose all their port access stuff. They basically lose everything. If they leave, then, like, your military units there are going to suffer because, look, on both sides, neither one of them can do logistics to where they have 3 meals a day. Like, I mean, everyone uses local shops. So if everyone leaves Crimea, the military's screwed.
Yeah.
So, like, I think the breaking point is going to be when Russia either says, okay, look, we have to move a bunch of air assets in to make sure our little civilian guys are happy, you know, the little land occupiers. Or if they leave, then what? Then Crimea is just a blank open space with nobody there. Like, I mean, Russia's getting to a point where they're going to have to pick and choose whether they defend Moscow, St. Petersburg, or they move assets into the occupied areas. I would assume Ukraine's going to start smacking the crap out of Donetsk, Luhansk as well, not just Crimea.
Well, they've been doing that.
But I mean, like, on the same levels as Crimea. So, like, if they end up having all these issues in Donetsk, Luhansk as well, and everything goes to a halt and there's no more economy, what are you going to do with the 7 million Russians that moved in since 2014? You either protect them or they leave, or you have governance issues.
Or you do that when you do mobilization, you mobilize the occupied areas first.
I don't think there's anyone to mobilize left.
Yeah, maybe not.
I mean, it will be, I don't want to say easy, but it will be possible for them to mobilize up to 100K. So then some people who will, like, voluntarily sign the contract, and then some small secret mobilization inside of Russia. So they will have not enough manpower, but in general, frankly speaking, it will lead literally to nowhere.
But I think it's a lot easier for Russia to hide bodies than it is 7 million people getting pissed off.
Well, but they're not even hiding bodies. I mean, people know the casualties.
Yeah.
They're just, they're like, look, some are signing contracts, others are being forced in it, but usually because they have criminal issues or they're like the dregs of society. Whatever the overall Russia as a country is okay with this to some extent, right? I'm not saying Russians are happy with the war. I think a lot of them, I think, would prefer the war ended, but they are. It's not such an issue that they are going to rise up and.
No, I don't think you'll see them rise up either. But they're going to create governance issues if people keep getting unhappy. Like, you can only keep things in check for so long before, shit hits the fan. I don't think they're going to rise up and storm, military barracks, but, like, it'll create an issue for Russia. Like, obviously, if there'll be crime, there'll be other stuff. I mean, look, you have to have, people have to have some semblance of livelihood. Otherwise, it'll all just go south. No one's going to live in Crimea if they can't provide for their families, if they can't drive to work. I mean, like, it'll get bad if Ukraine keeps doing it. And again, I think by making the people who moved in to occupy this land uncomfortable every day of their life for the next 6 months, especially over winter, I think it'll create a problem with Russia. Is Crimea going to rise up and, overthrow the government? No, but it's going to create governance issues for the Russians. And, like, either Russia's going to waste a bunch more money trying to keep the economy afloat in Crimea, doing whatever they can to protect stuff, or they say, well, we don't care about Crimea, and then if it happens in Donetsk and Luhansk, and they say, oh, we're going to protect Moscow, St. Petersburg, they're definitely going to have issues. I don't think, again, it's not going to be like them attacking the military, but they're going to run into all sorts of issues trying to keep them afloat economically.
Frankly speaking, I think it's clear that Russia in general doesn't care about Crimea. And I also don't care about, for example, Belgorod, which is also under fire. Yeah. No one cares about each other. All of them live in their small castles under governor, and they're quite fine with that. But I would like to move forward a little bit and to ask a question. Okay, we are striking Crimea. Most of our so-called middle strikes take part in the southern direction. And the question is, what's next? And I think that's one of the things that divided Fedorov and Syrskyi, because seems like they have different opinions. Fedorov was okay with continuous striking, but Syrskyi seems like that, okay, we are striking them, we're decreasing the possibilities, and we need to move forward. We need to have an assault operation. Of course, it's a question: assault operation with whom, how to do that, where, who's responsible, planning, and etc. And blah blah. You mentioned today Kursk, and I remember that I fought against 76 Air Assault Division, and I remember that we destroyed like dozens of the BMDs, infantry fighting vehicles, dozens, maybe more, I don't know, of the paratroopers. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of bodies, and I thought, oh, it's quite huge for them. But frankly, all of us, we know how Kursk ended. We lost approximately 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, MRAPs, tanks, and etc. of armor, like Bradley, Striker, and etc. And it's not replaced. We lost a lot of people. And right now, these assault divisions that I mentioned, they fulfill with manpower and infantry fighting vehicles with, as far as I remember, with 93%. Mm-hmm. But, for example, Ukrainian anti-second assault brigade, far from that. 91st, far from that. 80th Air Assault Brigade, far from that. 36, my former Marine Brigade, far from that.
Yeah.
So, but Russia fulfilled the strategic reserves with manpower, with vehicles, with drones, and etc.
We just need to create 2 new brigades.
Absolutely, two army corps, I think. we have too much colonels.
So this is an interesting point of we think back to the strategy of the war, right? Is how do we end the war on the best terms for Ukraine? And I think Fedorov's idea, maybe I'm gonna misexplain this, but was to raise costs, to inflict too many losses on Russia, which is unsustainable. Where they are not recruiting enough people to replace those losses, to not build new units, so on. Also to try and cut off logistics for middle strike, operational strike campaign, to make it more difficult for them to fight, and strategically to raise costs, right? To make Crimea a liability, to go after the refineries, to go after the economy, and to make it to the point where Russia just cannot sustain the war, and they need to end the war on some terms. Syrskyi is an offensive-minded general, right? Which is probably what most generals are, most officers are. He obviously led the Kharkiv offensive, led the Kursk offensive to successful operations. Some of the criticism directed to him is that first is assault units, assault regiment corps that's been created, and I think they just reorganized it last week. Yeah. That's come under a lot of criticism recently. Fedorov mentioned this as well, but also it's the idea of when do you need to do assaults, when do you need to counterattack, because there are times when the conditions are right, when you can counterattack. Maybe Russians take a village, but they're very vulnerable. If you push them back right away, you can retake the territory. One of the issues the last couple of years, there are a lot of counterattacks done, where basically it was the default option. If a commander acknowledges he loses a position, he's immediately told counterattack, retake it. And usually when they lost position, it's like, well, we don't have enough infantry to hold this position, and so we definitely don't have the guys to retake it. And that led to a bunch of issues in the military, including line, where basically commanders I'm not going to acknowledge a lost position, because either I'll get fired or I'll be told to retake it, and I know we can't do it. And then either I have to refuse that order, in which case I'll be fired, or I can't execute this basically. This has been an issue that people have mentioned before, that there's this kind of bias towards counterattacks. Sometimes when it's not, the conditions are not there, right? And there is some of this criticism has been mentioned most specifically to Skala, right? So Ukraine set up a number of assault regiments. These were mostly volunteer units that became assault battalions in 2024. Some of them led the operation in Kursk, so 225th was there, Skala, 33rd, a few other ones. This became a kind of real point of focus for Syrskyi. It's kind of his own force that he created himself. They're a huge priority for new soldiers, so new mobilized soldiers. These regiments get, I think, more soldiers per month than some army corps get. They're a huge priority for vehicles, for Bradleys, Abrams, other kind of equipment. His theory is that, most brigades are undermanned. Most of them cannot do assault actions. Let's focus, resources into making some that can do this, or some that can plug gaps in the front line. But the reputations are very different. And so each regiment is very different. It all depends on the kind of commander, what kind of, standard he set. In particular, so Fedorov, he mentioned two, which I'll talk about. So he mentioned Skala. Skala has, in many areas, not a great reputation in the Ukrainian military. Again, it depends. It always depends on who you talk to. Partially because the idea that they do assaults too often, a lot of those assaults are unsuccessful. They don't necessarily set conditions for success in some cases, or at least that's the kind of reputation. There's been some recent investigations into them about how many of the soldiers that have been mobilized who have died non-combat deaths in training. There's allegations that soldiers are kind of beaten or are kind of abused in training, and so a variety of kind of issues. The flip side, I would say, is that Skala, where they go, they hold the front line, right? They do plug gaps. They have had success in some offensive operations, and there is some point, I would say, in assault units where these are not going to be friendly places, right? You need units sometimes that have to breach, that have to be ready to take losses, and sometimes that leads to certain kind of cultures that are not what we think would be good cultures on the civilian side, right? In terms of discipline and other things. But I think there's different views of that unit. Then you have, say, Code 9.2, you have 1st Assault Regiment. Code 9.2, Fedorov mentioned, it's kind of, when he talks about drone assault concept, this is the unit he's talking about. And so they played a big role in the Kupiansk operation last year. Very small number of infantry. I think we mentioned before on some podcasts, but less than 100 infantry did this operation. Went very heavy into use of drones. And basically created localized superiority in drones, which set conditions for moving forward, and the attrition ratio was very, very favorable. And so even though you're doing offensive operation, even though you take a lot of losses, they had a very good attrition ratio in this operation, and it became this kind of standard that Fedorov wanted to apply elsewhere. Like, this is the doctrine we want to kind of establish, and so you have, again, this kind of mixed area there. But part of the question comes back to, right, for this war, does Ukraine need to focus on another offensive? Or does Ukraine need to focus on just making the war unsustainable for Russia? Because if you do another offensive, maybe you take back territory, but you also have risk, right? Do you have enough manpower to do this? And what if you have a failed offensive where you lose a lot of guys? What does that lead to in mobilization, so on?
I'm for Syrskyi on this. Like, look, I don't agree with that man on much. Because, just past place I've been in where he was the one in charge, Bakhmut. But I think now, one could argue that there is a much better chance at doing offensive maneuver warfare than there was in 2023. Drones have shaped this war to the point to where you no longer have second-line infantry. Your second line is now the first part of your drone line, so your DJI, bomber drones, whatever small ISR type, sometimes FPV-2.
Sorry for interrupting. I think it's like this drone line, the first line, it's all one line.
Yeah, but you have your infantry at 0, then you have your DJI, whatever small ISR, and then behind that you'll have your FPV teams, and on the Ukraine side bomber teams. But I think one could argue now that once you get past that 0 line, if you get within the enemy's drone line, you can basically do whatever you want as an assault unit, because the only thing holding both sides right now are drones. If you get within the other side's drone line and you start, clearing each drone position, they can't launch drones at you. Your ground stations are typically directional. So for them to actually be able to hit you with drones, they're going to have to rotate their stuff, or they're going to have to say, screw it, go back to goggles. So I think Syrskyi is right that there's opportunities for assaults. I don't think me and him are going to be on the same wavelength or same, how to get to that point. I don't think Ukraine has found a medium on, this is what we need to do to shape the battlefield. This is how we deny. Because the biggest thing right now is if we smack every enemy drone team, if we destroy their logistics, or let me rephrase that. If we keep destroying degrading and destroying their logistics at 100 kilometers deep, going back to what you first said, we're not seeing this at the 0 line yet. Yes, you're not going to see that for months, number one. But number two, we can hit vehicles all day long. They'll just truck them in by human, on foot, or they'll use ATVs, dirt bikes, whatever.
Yep.
So, the biggest thing we should be doing is area denial. My personal thought process is every tree line that's 15 to 20 kilometers deep, mine the shit out of it. Not 10, 20, 30, 1,000 mines. At 15 kilometers deep, if my front line's here and I know there's a tree line here, I'm going to put 1,000 landmines in that tree line. Simply because drone teams are logistics intensive. You know, if you need to bring 20 drones in every 3 days, you have 20 drones, 20 batteries, 20 munitions. Like, it's not like one person can resupply a drone team. It takes 3 to 4. And then if you use all the drones, you got to get it again. Nobody's walking through open fields. They're using tree lines. Mine every tree line. Shape the battlefield properly.
Fox, you mentioned definitely a lot of things.
I've been wanting to do assault. Like,
I think
2026, you could see a clear definition on where there's opportunity to exploit. It's just getting to that stage to where we can move forward.
I'm pretty sure we went over all the same things in the first podcast we did.
Yeah, I mean, how to bring maneuver back requires huge report, and there might be a couple of series of podcasts. But you mentioned a couple of things I would like to add.
Only thing I agree with Syrskyi on, by the way.
Short remarks. Yeah, but I mean, it's a good take because, okay, we're striking an operation that's fine, great. What's next?
That's what I mean. You got to shape. You got to do something with it.
You need to use this opportunity because they will adapt, they will jam, they intercept, and then
they are.
I think there's a short window that we can take it. Like, I think by February, March of 2027, what we're doing now obviously is not going to work. It's going to get harder. It's going to get more difficult. So we do have, like, Syrskyi's right. We have a short window. We got to do something if we're going to do it. If we're not going to do it, that's fine. Plan out the next 6 to 12 months and let's get that strategy moving. If we're going to do something, let's do it, preferably not in Zaporizhia. But
Rob, you mentioned Bakhmut and you mentioned a big amount of lie. Well, it's definitely from both sides, but if you talk about Ukrainian one, I'm sure 100% sure that it's this kind of lie started when Bakhmut campaign was going, and it's not because of Syrskyi, to be honest. Bakhmut became a very political issue, and after that, somehow Ukrainians started being very vulnerable to this and sensitive to this news that we are losing some village Perdyayivka with 5 residents who live in there. Frankly speaking, since the beginning of the war, I told myself, okay, dude, I don't care about this village, this city, or whatever, or anything. I'm thinking about this from the perspective whether it's suitable for the defense, whether we have hills or etc. or not. I wanna, as I said today, secure. I wanna have the possibility where my maneuver brigades are capable of advancing and defending, not to die on regular basis in attempts to retake some position. Okay, we're losing the land, fine, but you need to secure the army, secure your people. They need to stay alive. Well, it sounds maybe funny during the war, but as long as possible, to be able to do something in the future. You don't need to retake every position you lost or every village or city. But Ukrainians became so sensitive with this question, and it wasn't like that because during summer 22, we kind of lost. Almost lost Luhansk area, and no one was crying in social media. It was like, and we lost it. And
the attrition rate, I think,
And the thing is that you mentioned drone assault units. I would like to mention that the first time that we said something like that was 2023 when Superiority created this concept. And frankly speaking, back then, for me, it was more like really drone assault unit rather than we have right now with code point 9.2 or some other units. Because if you kill most of your enemy with drones, that means that you're a drone assault unit and then you assault. I don't think so. You just kill as much as possible with drones and then your infantry going and clearing the trenches or whatever. But the question is, does it mean that you're a drone assault unit?
No,
I don't think so.
I think there's a big difference. So I was part of the Syrskyi thing in 2023. A lot of our chosen company videos was part of that experiment as well. Like, a lot of people think like they just used a bunch of drones, hit the positions, and then we assaulted. In reality, like when we were moving forward, there's always like one DJI drone following every 4 guys or every vehicle. So if we had 3 vehicles on a mission, we had 3 DJIs following. Once you get out of the vehicle, the DJI follows that team. And then we also had FPVs or other DJIs to drop grenades. Like, we would plan out literally what position to hit, how to hit it with the drone teams. And so, like, we planned everything extremely drone heavy. It looked like we did a lot of the work. Like, we shot a lot of people. But, like, actually, like, prepping the area and everything it was all drones. Our call for fires, We use drone like FPVs for that. Like we use FPVs for everything. Like DJI drones for dropping grenades.
Yeah,
like
to be honest,
drone assault. I think drone assaults in 2023, what we were doing, is way more advanced than what you currently see. To be honest, and I've been hoping somebody. Sukarevsky needs to go somewhere and just like sit down Code 9.2 or whoever and say, hey, look, here's how we did it. Adjust it to modern drones and then go for it. Because there's been like a huge thing lacking on it.
I mean, there's, again, drone assault it's just, you're doing offensive operations, you're incorporating drones.
Yeah.
And so you bring in drones, you figure out how can drones augment what we already have? How can they enable certain things? Because again, there's been this, and I agree with you. I think the prospects for offensive operations are better now than they were before.
Yeah.
I think the Middle Strike campaign, the ability to isolate, parts of the front line is far approved and far better than it was a year ago. And so before, if you try and concentrate in one direction, you can do this. There's possibility of success, we saw in the Huliaipole direction elsewhere. But if you can isolate an objective for logistics, make it difficult for resupply, make it difficult for reinforcements, then you can achieve more, right? You can actually achieve more. And I went back in February. I met a bunch of units that did the little offensive operation northeast of Huliaipole.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked to a bunch of units there. And actually, Skala is actually a decent example. So they achieved like a small breach where they got to Ternova. And it was maybe 70 kilometers past the front line. I forget the number. Every unit, because of gray zone, will sometimes give you, pretty inflated numbers. Like, we breached like 20 kilometers. Like, well, the Russians didn't really hold all of that area, but okay. But what they did achieve a breach. They achieved it with like ATVs, light vehicles, also BMPs. And they got into Ternova. They reached where FPV teams were. And they were getting the firefights with these teams. The problem was that there was no one to exploit it. And so they achieved the breach. If they could have pulled the brigades near them and said, okay, follow it behind them and just exploit this. Just keep driving, create chaos behind the Russian lines. It was absolutely possible. And the Russians, Russian Telegram channels were absolutely just like, I'm not going to use a bad word like you, but they were actually, having very, very concerned about what's going on. Because the Ukrainians really did have a chance to like have a localized collapse of front line there. And that's why also, again, when I talk about Skala, there's a lot of negative things about them, about different treatment, other things. What I will say, though, is if you need a unit to breach part of the front line before you can exploit elsewhere, this is a unit that's willing to do it, right? They'll take casualties. You do need to have a unit that's willing to take casualties to achieve a breach like this. And ultimately, they're able to do this. And in that operation, what happened is that they were able to locate all the Russian drone positions, and they suppressed them with BM-21s, right? It was nothing complex. It was just, okay, we know the tree lines where they're going to be. As you said, if you spend time doing proper reconnaissance, you try and mine the routes. So the FPV teams have fewer FPVs on position, fewer antennas, so on. They can't rotate often. And then when you do the operation itself, you suppress artillery, BM-21s, bomber drones, FPVs, whatever. Drones can enable offensive operations just as they're making difficult too. And so again, it's not just the problem; it's part of the solution. Russians identified this last year as well. I mean, Rubicon and their kind of developments was part of this idea of we have to overcome Ukrainian drone teams with our own drone teams. It didn't ultimately succeed, but the concept behind it, I think, made sense. I also think we saw what happened in Kupiansk, we saw what happened in Huliaipole. Russian lines are not that strong, right? They are, as you said, there's the initial line infantry, but these infantry are not there to defend. They're there to keep moving forward. So they're kind of like, it's kind of like a waypoint as they move forward, right? It's not like a dug-in defense. It's not like with sectors of fire and that kind of stuff. Also, they don't really care about the infantry too much. So it's not like these guys are that high, well-trained, don't have much of the way AT weapons. It's really the assumption that Ukraine lacks the forces to do an offensive operation and that Russia has enough Mavics, FPVs, Molnia to make anything too difficult. If you can suppress them, if you drive to them very quickly, 5-7 kilometers to the front line, these guys could run away. And then there's nothing dedicated behind that, right? And so you can really create chaos. That's what we saw, I think, in Huliaipole. And again, like I really do think that there was a missed opportunity in January, early February. I think Ukraine could have really created a small collapse of the front line of the Russians in that direction. But my view is this kind of command and control issue where every regiment was kind of doing their own thing. You needed someone right in charge of them. And right when you had this breach of one of the units, that commander should have grabbed a different brigade and said, okay, stop what you're doing. follow behind these guys and just keep exploiting and see where you can go. But it also comes back to, what was the objective of that operation? It's not clear to me there was a very clear objective.
They probably didn't think they were going to get that far, honestly. I don't think anyone's planning to breach, 5, 7, 8 kilometers deep. It's like, hey, let's get to, on the Ukrainian side, it's probably still, hey, let's get to the zero, re-grab it, then move a kilometer deep.
Right.
I don't think anyone on the Ukrainian side is really saying, hey, let's plan for a, tactical depth maneuver 10 kilometers deep on the Russian side. We get to this area and then we halt. Honestly, if they would have got 7 kilometers in and nobody messed with them, they would have kept going probably. With there's just no, they don't ever really clearly define their objectives on assaults.
Well, I do think we throw a Third Corps. I do think Third Corps is trying to take that salient back right now. I think that is one of their objectives. We're seeing. There's not too much information out there, but there's been geolocated footage that shows Ukrainian units have advanced in that direction. There's a salient north of Liman, and my view, based on just the open source information, they're trying to probably cut off that salient, which I think makes entire sense to me. But again, it all comes back to, what is the strategy? What is your operational purpose? What is the intent all the way down? You have to know if it's nested, where what you're doing at a tactical level. How does it fit in with the operation and the strategic levels? And that all has to be clear. If it's not clear, then you have units doing different things, and they might be beneficial, but they're not necessarily working efficiently to one purpose.
Yeah, we can definitely continue discussing this, bringing Batman back. But I don't want to have this for our podcast because we agreed to discuss what Fedorov mentioned. Because, as I said, this topic requires a separate podcast and a couple of researchers.
Yep.
Because I can also add a lot of things, but I maybe will try to moderate this right now.
No, you're good. You're good.
All right. Let me.
One last thing, quick.
Yeah.
I will say, Skala is a perfect example of having extremely bad public affairs as well.
Oh yeah.
When I talk about public affairs issues and how to approach the public in Ukraine and how institutions and the military are not the best at it, Skala is a perfect example. They don't ever get out in front of things when it's happening. They wait, or if they do get out in front of it, it's always, that's Russian propaganda. These guys are traitors.
Let's create AI videos that we hold in the line.
Yeah, Skala is a perfect example of how not to operate a military unit for public affairs. I don't know who's in charge of it, but this is one of those things where find somebody like Fedorov that can run your public affairs so you can get in front of the issues before it blows up everywhere on social media, whether it's in the West social media, Ukrainian, Russian. And then obviously fix your issues too. So
one other point I'd make though. So in the Marines, there's often quite a bit of variance between different Marine infantry battalions. And it's not because the quality of the Marines is different. It's quality of just sometimes leadership or certain factors. I don't believe that they're bad units typically. I think, again, Skala has tons of guys who are bravely fighting every day, holding the front line, that have done really tremendous work. I think it's important when you talk about a unit, you say, okay, they have some reputational issues on different things.
Yeah.
It's important to keep in mind. It's look, you have Skala has done a very important job holding Pokrov's direction for most of the winter. They've reinforced lots of parts of the other parts of the front line. They do hold the front line. They're not running away. So I think there's also my view is never going to be black and white. I think there's some gray area here, but I do think again it's important to keep in mind these guys. A lot of them are doing a great job fighting. They've done a tremendous job holding the front line, and by no means we talk about some of these issues. Should we say that this is reflects poorly?
No, yeah. Again, a lot of it's public affairs though. If they would approach the public affairs side of it better, maybe the Ukrainians or whoever wouldn't be the unit's bad because look. The unit's been around for a while. Are they a bad unit? No. Again, they're holding ground. They're taking ground. And people should be aware, especially Ukrainian society, and this is probably something that the general staff and MOD did a bad job on. You need to be aware, if you're an assault regiment and your whole deal is to assault, your casualty ratio is going to be much higher than if you're defending a position because you're the minute you step across the zero line, it's either go or get fucked up all the way back. So there's only two options, even in 2023.
And this is part of the issue, I think also. It's not that the assault regiments are bad.
No,
it depends how they're employed.
Yep.
If they're example, if someone loses a village and they're ordered to do a counterattack the next day, right? If you don't spend time setting conditions for an assault, it will probably fail. With the drone environment and so on, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to do this. If you're ordered to do one the next day, it's probably not going to succeed. Is it the unit's fault if they're ordered to do this? Not necessarily, in my opinion. Again, my view is on most of these things. We talk about Fedorov, we talk about Syrskyi, everyone else. It's not a black and white issue. I think you have, you can say positive things in one direction, negative things in one direction, but there's not a black and white on many of these things. I think there's always kind of good and bad things we get to say. And I also think that it's being in command of a war is incredibly difficult. I don't think there's an easy way of doing it. I saw my war at the platoon level, company level, which is much simpler than it is at the high level.
Very nice take that you mentioned that you saw the war from your perspective. I mean, being a company commander, or from my side being a surgeon, of course, I did much more than being a surgeon. But in the same time, I realized, because before the full-scale invasion, I started war with pro-Russian separatists, and of course, I had more emotions and more critics. But when I joined the army, I kind of understood that how foolish I was, and this is what usually happens when people joining the army. They in years started understanding that it's not that simple as you can imagine, and it's definitely not black and white. But as to Skala, I cannot be, frankly speaking, supportive of them. But from my perspective, I understand if you have regiments that consist of 10K, which is division, and you need to also understand the quality of personnel who serve there. It's also another thing that people do not discuss.
It's like more than 1,000 drug addicts, former drug addicts, and alcohol.
And it's only about some addictions, but there are other issues, let's say, in this way. And if people die during the training, if they really die during the training because of some different things, if you have like 10K, well, that's the reality. And it's also a question whether you need to have this kind of regiment with 10K of personnel, because it's how to control everyone if they are spread all around the front line. Try to look at everyone, and every battalion, detachment commander, whatever you call them, and every NCO, company commander, try to communicate with them. It's literally not doable. So the question is, what's the freaking point of that? I mean, you want to have these people who will be able to retake something or break through? Fine, understandable. See no point of doing this if you have airborne that assault units, because they're assault units, and they did it before with armor, with all the NATO procedures. They just do not talk about this like hearty, we created a battle management, a battle captain, congrats. I mean, airborne did it years ago because they've been trained by NATO countries. So the thing is that people really do not understand how the system works. Of course, the system is, in some cases, horrible, and people who are doing some things should be punished and go to the jail, not just fired from the army, go to the jail. Need to be investigation. But also the question is, if you allow to build your army in this way, which is absolutely no back idea behind this, it's question may be to those who, as you said, who deploy those troops in the way he deploys them.
It's also another issue where, and we can segue into the other discussion we want to get into. Mobilization is a big problem in Ukraine. It's been a big problem for a long time. Ukraine has not gotten many volunteers since 2023. And when they get volunteers, it's like for drone units or so on. People don't want to go into infantry. They don't want to go to assault units typically. The creation of assault units, part of this comes back to the issue with mobilization, where you don't have enough willing people who want to be infantrymen to hold the front line. And so the way a lot of assault regiments are resourced, they got a lot of prisoners. So initially they set up, Skala battalions. All the prisoner battalions have a different kind of code of conduct about, even when the mechanized brigades, right? Where it's like, hey,
59.
We are going to lead these guys in a different way. It's going to be more draconian, but there's a certain kind of prison rule of way we lead people, right? And so some of the stories you hear of Skala, other things, these are stories I heard from Skala battalions that were in mechanized brigades too.
Yeah.
And so part of it comes back to, again, you're not, the assault regiments are not getting 19-year-old motivated, young guys, right? They're not getting what you had before the war. You're getting older people. They're mobilized. No one wants to be a infantryman assault unit right at this point in the war, typically.
Except foreigners.
Yes, but on the first assault, and then they're like, maybe not, But it comes back to how do you have guys who are motivated to go in a situation where there's a high likelihood of being killed or wounded? And the way you maintain discipline, it's sometimes uglier than it would be in an ideal situation. And again, the one thing I would say is, my perspective is from U.S. military. So U.S. Marines, everyone I served was a volunteer. I went to Afghanistan, everyone volunteered to go. I did back-to-back deployments. Everyone volunteered to go again, right? So they did 7 months on ship. Like, okay, and we knew we were going to go to Marja. That was the worst place in Afghanistan. Everyone volunteered to do this. All my guys were young. We're all very, very good physical shape. There's no, drug issues and that kind of stuff. So I went there on like ideal conditions, leading mobilized military with older people who bring every type of issue from society, from alcoholism, from physical issues, is entirely different. And of course, when we remember all the Vietnam stories, Vietnam is not known as a high point in like U.S. military, kind of command and control, right? We had issues of fragging, we had all sorts of problems too. We just haven't dealt with that for 50 years, but we have experienced the same problems. And I think how there's no perfect solution, and I think we should avoid kind of black and white, approaches to some of these things, because it's not easy, it's not simple, and I think it's just difficult in general kind of to talk about always. But all right,
they need to fix their public affairs. Optics
that's
is like
part of it.
Man, optics is like 90% of it.
Okay, but all right. So the story this week as well. The commander of the 155th Mechanized Brigade, former commander, is the former chief of staff of Skala. He went over to 155th. 155th has kind of served under Skala the last 6 months. So that commander was arrested. Allegedly, he had 7 or 8 of his subordinates pick up 2 guys, kidnap them, and executed them. So this is another story.
I mean, from my point of view, like, look, so if the commander did that and then 7 or 8 guys did that, like, where's the chain of command in between that? Like, honestly, they should just dissolve the 155th at this point. Like, there's been issues since the start with it. Take the good guys, put them in a unit that can actually utilize them properly. They get treated properly. Get rid of all the shitheads, lock them up, whatever. Give them shovels. But there's honestly, like, if a brigade commander or battalion commander was able to get 7 or 8 guys, away from duty, like, okay, so these 7 or 8 guys, they're enlisted. Okay, where's their officer for their company commander?
It was a battalion commander there too.
Yeah, but like, where? That's what I mean though. Like, there's been a leadership issue all the way down the totem pole here, and this isn't the first time with them. So at this point, just get rid of the unit, move the guys into a unit that has proper command, that already has like, a foundational level of command, and let them, work there, succeed there. Because like, if a battalion commander, like, where's the other officers that allowed 7 or 8 of their guys to leave? Like, where's your company commanders? Like, you just don't know that 7 or 8 guys.
Allegedly, battalion commander was part of this.
I know, but that's what I mean. Though. Like, how do you not let 7 or 8 guys travel 4.5 hours, 7 hours, whatever away, and nobody knows?
That's one of the issues that Fedorov mentioned.
Yes,
that we continue creating new units, and we're not even capable of fulfilling them with manpower, with artillery shells, with drones, with officers, with NCOs, with literally no one. And I remember my latest brigade, that it was a new one, based on the former mechanized battalion. We didn't have headquarters, to be honest, in general.
That's what I mean. Like, just get rid of the 155th, take the officers, move them to other headquarters.
Yeah, that's
like,
clear.
But there's positions for everyone.
Yeah, but that's the problem, is that we do not do this. We expand, and right now we are creating two new unmanned system forces brigades.
And 4 mechanized.
And we are taking people from already existing unmanned system forces brigades to those 2 new ones, and try to guess whether they are good one or bad one. So, and how they are supposed to lead the brigade. Okay, he is a lieutenant, and I'm just right now talking about a real guy, and he is really retarded. And he was sent from my former brigade to this new one. And he has their responsibility. He will be a chief of staff of a battalion. This is the most deorganized guy I've ever met, to be honest.
But I mean, again,
We have this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, let's go to the next
Sorry.
topic. Otherwise,
okay.
I'll be on this for hours.
We can talk about a lot of things for hours. Okay. we started using some not great language too. So let's pull back. Okay.
Hello, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed this episode today. And if you did, please like, comment, and share on wherever you're viewing or listening to this podcast. Whether if you're on YouTube, please leave comments and share and subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to this on the podcast apps, please download us, subscribe to us so you get notified as every new episode when it comes out. It will go straight to your inbox. You can also go to our website, sign up for our email list to be notified of future initiatives of the Ukraine Military History Institute, future episodes as they come out, and also some events that we run here in Kyiv for the community. Borderlands Foundation has some community meetups. So if any of those things are interesting to you, please sign up for our email list. And then finally, this is funded by the Borderlands Group. It's a consultancy that I run that helps Ukrainian foreign companies, military companies, Ukrainian companies that are trying to grow their business, get feedback from their products from frontline units, and develop their products for the battlefield so that they're useful for both Ukraine but also other countries that want to use their military technology products. So if you'd like to learn more about what we do, whether it's getting in touch with Rob or other members of the podcast to write reports or advise you, whether you're a military or government that wants to understand what's going on in the war in Ukraine for your own national security, or if you'd like to work as a military technology company inside Ukraine and learn from and develop your technology here, please go to the Borderlands Group website. Leave us a message. We'll be in touch and see how we can help you learn from and contribute to Ukraine's victory here in this war.